Australia and New Zealand are looking to boost engagement with Pacific Island nations, just as Beijing begins its charm offensive in the region. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has pledged $350 million in additional aid for defence training, security and infrastructure in the South Pacific. She arrived in Fiji on the same day that her Chinese counterpart touched down in the Solomon Islands to sign a controversial security pact. It's the first stop of Wang Yi's 8-nation tour of the Pacific. It's said that Beijing is looking to seal a bigger region-wide deal while he's in the area. It's something that Australia's newly elected leader hopes to counter with his own diplomatic efforts.
Australia dropped the ball. We can't afford to do that. We need to re-engage with the region. They're sovereign nations, of course, and we need to respect that. But we need to be offering more support, and otherwise we can see the consequences with the deal that was done with the Solomons.
New Zealand has also responded to China's security push in the region, with Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern insisting the Pacific has the means and the ability to respond to any challenges. And for more on this, we're joined by Daniel Robertson in Sydney. Daniel, what would the multi-million-dollar assistance that Australia is promising entail? And what more beyond that can we expect?
Yeah, well, when Labor pledged hundreds of millions of dollars for the Pacific, it initially said that it would help address decades of development gains that were lost during the pandemic. Their 4-year plan will help bolster things like health, education, the economy and climate change. And that was all part of their election campaign to ensure that Australia remains a priority when it comes to the Pacific. Now, they have also promised that they want to also build a military school in the Pacific to help bolster their defence and security forces. And alongside this, $500 million worth of aid. And they've also promised to work with the Pacific on things like climate change as well as migration. All of these big promises to ensure that Australia can be secured as a partner for the Pacific Islands and to help counter China's growing influence in the region. Now, this week, the government said, well, they really took aim at the previous Morrison government, saying that all of these programs are necessary and that they have a lot of work to do because, in their words, they have to make up for lost time after nearly a decade in the coalition government.
As you mentioned, making up for lost time there by Australia, how concerning is China's push in the region for the new administration?
Yeah, well, China's growing influence is a concern and their movements are being watched very closely by Australia. China's growing influence in the region has also been seen as a threat, and the Pacific Islands are increasingly becoming the centre of this power struggle. Australia's newly elected Foreign Minister Penny Wong has now embarked on her own blitz of the Pacific, visiting Fiji, and that's really an early sign of her determination to deepen relations with the Pacific and to try and counter talks that the Pacific might have with China. Of course, the Pacific Islands are crucial to Australia, and the issue of security has been raised before. Recently, the Solomon Islands did a security pact with China, despite objections from Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And that raised fears that China might be able to get a military footing in the Pacific. Now, China denied that and said that the pact was purely domestic. But China's visit to the Pacific this week, well, we may be seeing similar pacts being made or something similar that they are trying to gain. And Australia's foreign minister says when it comes to deals and policies with Australia that our intentions are clear.
And Australia will be a partner that doesn't come with strings attached, nor imposing unsustainable financial burdens. We're a partner that won't erode Pacific priorities or Pacific institutions. We believe in transparency.
Since World War II, Australia has remained the primary partner for the Pacific, and that is something that China is trying to change and that Australia is trying to retain.
And thanks for that. Daniel Robertson speaking to us there from Sydney.